Join us for the Criterion Institute podcast as Joy Anderson, a global thought leader in business and social change, leads us through a series of discussions, interviews, frameworks, rants, and reframes that will help you better understand how to use finance as a tool for transformative systems change.
I am Joy Anderson, and this is the Criterion Institute podcast. A friend of mine recently asked a question that stuck with me. She said, Joy, where have you changed your mind? I bet folks would want to know. She actually thought it would be a good episode for this podcast, and so here we are. It is a good question, the kind you ask if you want to know if someone actually is learning, or are they defending the same positions with somewhat better language. But when I sat with it, I realized I don't usually experience changing my mind. I don't often move from believing A to believing not A. What actually changes is how I see. Same facts, same rooms, maybe the same work, but a different frame around it. And once I see differently, I can't keep behaving the way I did before, or I hope that's true. So what this episode's really about is not really a set of hot takes of what I've reversed over the years, but a few big reframes. Places where I took the exact same reality and started seeing it differently, and then my behavior followed. But like most episodes, this one comes to you in pieces. In the first longer piece, I walk through 3 of those reframes, how I moved in my own head from one thing to another. And then a shorter piece at the end where I sit with something underneath all of this. Because before you can put a new frame on anything, you have to be able to see it. So I'll close by asking where that ability to see comes from and what it has to do with being welcomed into worlds that were not built around you. Same facts, new frame. Let's get into it. A few weeks ago, Debbie Evans on our team asked me a question that stuck with me. She said, Joy, where have you changed your mind? I bet people would want to know. It's a great question. It's actually the kind of question you ask when you want to know if someone's actually learning or just defending the same positions with better language. But when I sat with it, I realized I don't usually experience it as changing my mind. I don't often feel like I used to believe A and now I believe not A. But what it feels like from the inside is that I change how I see something. The facts are the same rooms, the same partners, the same work. But I put a different frame around it. I see it through a different lens. And once I see it differently, I can't keep behaving the way I did before. So this episode isn't really a list of hot takes I've reversed over the years. It's more about a few big reframes. Places where I took the exact same reality and started seeing it differently. And the story is same facts, new frame, and then my behavior had to change. In particular, I want to talk about one thread that's run through a lot of my life in finance and in social change. The sense that I was an outsider, that other people were doing the real work, and Criterion and I were just support to them. In this episode, I want to unpack how I've reframed that, how I've moved in my own head from being a slightly or massively neurotic outsider at the edge of a system to seeing myself who is inside the work, helping define it. And that's what's changed around funding, around boundaries, and around what I'm willing to own. So let me start with the first big frame that shifted for me. For a long time, partly because Criterion was a consulting firm in the early days back 25 years ago, I saw Criterion's role and my own role was there to support other people's work. We were the translators, the conveners, the strategy people. We'd come in and help a foundation or a fund or a movement clarify their strategy, build their tools, create frameworks, design processes. And I would have described that as supporting the field. Even that phrase, supporting the field, is doing a lot of work. Because if I'm supporting a field, it implies this field is over there. They are the protagonists. They have the main characters and the storyline. And I'm coming in from the side with helpful diagrams and a flip chart. Now, none of that was false. We were helping. We were supporting. The facts were, we were designing strategies and frameworks that other people then used. We were providing tools that didn't exist before. We were often the ones making sense of messy systems so that others could make their moves. But the frame I had around that was, we're here to help them do their real work. And once you see yourself that way, a couple things follow very quickly. If they're the protagonists and we're support, then you don't ask for the full resources it would take to do the work really well. You tolerate fuzzy scopes and impossible timelines because it's their project. You underinvest in your own infrastructure, your team, your systems, your time to think because that feels indulgent when your job is to serve others. That's pretty much what I did for a long time. We took work when, if I'm honest, we knew from day one it was underfunded for the level of thinking and design we are bringing. We talked about the importance of infrastructure for everyone else and patched our own with duct tape. Same facts, same meetings, same partners, but the story in my head was Criterion is supporting the people doing the real work. At some point, and it wasn't some single lightning bolt, it was a slow accumulation, I started to notice a disconnect. I'd be on calls where someone was building a program or a fund or a policy, and they were using our language. Our frameworks were becoming the backbone of their slides. Our way of thinking about gender or gender-based violence was being treated as the starting point. And I remember thinking, hold on, if our logic is actually part of the spine of this thing, why do I still think of us as the help? Nothing about the situation changed. We'd been playing that role for a while. What changed was the frame. I started to see what we do not as support, but as infrastructure building. We weren't just offering a nice add-on surface to people's work. We were designing the financial and narrative infrastructure that makes certain kinds of work possible at all. Once I let myself see it that way, a lot of my old behavior stopped making sense. If you believe you're just support, then underpricing your work feels humble. If you believe you're building core to infrastructure, underpricing looks irresponsible. If you think you're adding value at the margins, then it's fine to say yes to a vague brief. If you know you're designing the structure that other things will rest on, then you start saying, no, this needs to be framed differently and resourced properly, or we're going to build something fragile. Same facts, different frame. That one shift from we support to we build infrastructure pushed me to try, at least, to write scopes that reflect the real cost of the thinking, not just the workshops. To see investment in my team and our systems as part of the value we offer, not overhead we should hide. Say out loud, this is not just a technical assistance piece. This is foundational to whether or not this whole initiative works. And it's worth saying, no one gave me permission to make that shift. No one knighted us and said, you are now infrastructure. The work was already there. The facts already true. The shift was how I allowed myself to see it. Second frame is very related, but it lives a little bit more in my own nervous system. For years, in rooms, I would feel like an outsider, almost as a badge of honor. When I started teaching in 1989, a very nice man told me to pretend to be a teacher, to think of a teacher that I knew and pretend to be them. I had never taken a single teaching class in my life. I had no business being in this classroom, or so I thought. Then eventually in finance rooms, I was the weird person talking about gender and norms and power, and everybody else wanted to talk about products and pipeline and IRR. In feminist or social change pieces, I was the finance person. And you can hear the quotation marks around that, right? The finance person. Finance is often the cousin we are wary of sitting around the table. So the framing I carried around was, I'm lucky to be in this room. My job is to not take up too much space. My job is to translate myself into whatever language this room already understands. Same facts. I was invited back to these spaces. People asked me to speak, to help shape agendas, to advise. They were, in practice, treating me as someone whose thinking mattered. But my frame was, I'm on the edge of this, and I'm trying not to get thrown out of the circle. And again, once you see yourself that way, your behavior follows. You over-edit yourself. You sand off the edges of your analysis so it doesn't sound too much. You let the room's existing frame be the default, and you try to tuck your work inside it. You can feel how this showed up, right? I would come into a feminist convening and try to speak movement instead of speaking finance honestly. Or I'd go to investor discussion and try to make GBV sound like a risk factor they'd already recognized instead of saying, no, this is a structural issue you don't have language for. Somewhere along the way, again, slowly and incompletely, that frame stopped matching what was actually happening. Because the reality is, people weren't just inviting me to decorate their existing frameworks. They were asking me to create the frameworks. They'd say, help us think this through. Can you host a conversation about this? We're using your way of talking about this now. And at some point, I had to admit to myself, Joy, you're not being smuggled in here. You are part of defining what this field is. Facts didn't change. The invitations didn't magically become more prestigious. What changed was my willingness to see myself as inside the work, as someone who helps set the frame, not just work around the frame that's already there. Once I let that in, my behavior started to shift. I stopped bending our language to fit every room and started saying, here's how we talk about this, and here's why that matters. I became more willing to say, if we keep this as the frame, we're going to produce the wrong outcomes. And I also became more willing to walk away, or at least say, not like this, when a space wasn't willing to shift its frame enough for the work to have integrity. It's not really about ego. Maybe it is in part. It's about accepting that if you're doing the infrastructure work, conceptual, financial, narrative infrastructure, then you have a responsibility to the frame. If I pretend I'm just a guest in the room, I can avoid conflict and feel grateful to be included. If I accept that I'm co-authoring the frame, I have to speak up when the frame is wrong. The outsider story kept me grateful. The insider frame asks me to be accountable. The third frame is yet more personal, but it's also just as structural. For a lot of my career, probably has something to do with my family of origin story, I've operated with a very familiar story. Everyone else's needs are real. My limits are a problem I should manage privately. So the facts could be, I'm sick, I'm exhausted, I'm supposed to be on an advisory board call or at a convening or on yet another strategy sprint. And the old frame would say, well, you committed, you just make it work. You'll rest later. My health, my time, my cognitive bandwidth, those were things I negotiated with myself after I met the needs that I saw. Under that frame, canceling something because I was sick was failing. Saying no to a request felt like I was letting people down. Building in rest or spaciousness felt self-indulgent. And again, the behavior followed. I overextended. I took on timelines and scopes that assumed I had infinite elasticity. I didn't name my own bandwidth as a factor in planning the work. There was a moment, and this one did feel a little bit more like a click, where I chose not to go to something important when I was sick. And I didn't frame it in terms of asking for permission or forgiveness. I just decided, I'm sick, I'm not going, that's not up for debate. That was a tiny behavioral shift sitting on top of a much bigger reframing. My new frame, my time, my health, my energy are design constraints in this system. If we pretend they aren't, we're lying about the resources this work actually has. Once I started seeing it that way, it stopped feeling like a personal failure to cancel or say no. It started feeling like part of doing the work responsibly. Because if the work actually depends on me as a leader, as a builder of this infrastructure, then building plans that require me to ignore my limits is bad systems design. And I care a lot about system design. When I saw it that way, my behavior started to change. This one is a work in progress. I began to name my capacity as an explicit input into the conversation about strategy and timelines. I treat risk and focus not as private fantasies, but that is something that has to be designed into the system. I got more comfortable saying, no, not this quarter, not at that pace, not at that level of resourcing. Same facts, calendar, the demands, the body, new frame. My constraints are part of reality, not an inconvenience. And once again, once you see it that way, you can't go back. Or at least not without feeling the dishonesty of pretending you can stretch forever. So where does this leave Debbie's original question? Where have you changed your mind? I imagine this is not at all what she imagined. I still think it's the right question to ask. But for me, the honest answer is that the most important changes haven't been flipping positions. They've been changing how I see. Seeing our work not as support, but as infrastructure. Seeing myself not as an outsider sneaking into other people's rooms, but as someone who helps define the frame. Seeing my own limits not as personal failing, but as part of how we design systems that can actually hold the work. Facts didn't change overnight. We were already doing this work. We were already being invited into these rooms. I was already fully human and finite. What changed were the frames I allowed myself to use. And once the frame shifts, the meaning shifts. And once the meaning shifts, the behavior has to follow, or you feel that dissonance every day. So I want to leave you with a different version of Debbie's question, slightly edited for how I think. Not just, where have you changed your mind? But what are you looking at right now that might be ready for a different frame? Some part of your work where the facts are what they are, the budget, the partners, the roles, but the story you're telling about your place in that system is keeping you small or tired or leaving you on the edge. What would change if you saw yourself differently in that picture? If you moved in your own frame from helper to co-author, from outsider to someone inside the work, from an inexhaustible resource to a real constraint the system has to design around. Because once you see it differently, you may not be able to keep behaving in the same way. And that, at least in my life, is what changing my mind has looked like. Thanks for listening. The people a system was not built for are the ones who see it most clearly. Not the experts, not the people paid to fix it, the people it breaks. That should bother us more than it does, because it means the clearest sight in any room usually belongs to the person with the least power to act on it. And the people with power, the people who have the freedom to act, are often the ones who can't see it all. I've spent most of my life on the comfortable side of that line. I get to choose my moments, when to push, when to let go, when it's worth the risk to say the hard thing out loud. And most of the time, I can say it and survive having said it. This is privilege. The system I've spent my life trying to change still, mostly, works for me. So if I was going to see clearly, I had to see from somewhere outside my own comfort. There are a few places in the world where this has been a place to practice for me. One was teaching high school in Brooklyn, New York. I was a girl from Iowa who showed up in a school, mainstream school in Brooklyn, metal detectors, 5,000 students, the whole 9 yards of urban city chaos. But we used to joke that we should have to pay to teach because of the kids. They taught us every day, and I learned so much from teaching students that were just a couple years younger than me at the time. I was 21, they were 19. And I was teaching special education. I was teaching the kids who had gotten thrown out of the system, a system they could see very clearly. There have been other places I've been invited into, but the other experience that truly changed my life was spending a week in the Pacific with 25 seriously badass women's rights leaders talking about how to use finance to address gender-based violence almost 10 years ago now. That room changed me because it was a time similar to New York, similar to my travels to Memphis, Tennessee, similar to the times I spend now in Kenya or Nigeria. It was a time that I was welcomed into a world that wasn't mine, a place whose rules I didn't hold, that had never been arranged around me, and yet it was opened up by the people who inhabited it. And by the way, that welcome, all those places that I learned, that was never about me. It didn't exist to teach me anything or to move me along my own path of understanding. Those lives that I encountered were not a lesson, and the people in them owed me nothing. The welcome was simply theirs to give, and they gave it. What it did, without ever being for me, was take away every excuse I had not to look. Because when you've been led into a place that doesn't run on your terms, you can't coast. You have to watch. You have to see how it actually works and who it works for. And that's the turn. Once a world has shown to you plainly who it serves and who it doesn't, the question stops being about seeing at all. Seeing was hopefully never the truly hard part. The hard part is what comes after. Because seeing clearly and then doing nothing has a name. And it isn't wisdom. It isn't patience. It's the quiet, comfortable choice of a person who had the standing to call the question and stayed quiet anyway, who saw what was wrong and went along. That's the part that matters. Not did I get to see, but what did I do once I had? So I'll leave you with this question. Not how much do you understand? Not how clearly do you see, but where? Have you already seen something clearly and gone along with it anyway?
At Criterion Institute, our partners understand that shifting deeply entrenched power dynamics can't be done with a single training session or report. Our most successful engagements have spanned years, not months, and involve close collaboration within one of our 6 systems change approaches. We're currently in the midst of advancing some remarkable change around how power is seen and addressed in our financial systems. We hope our work sparks your thinking about what might be possible together, and we invite you to have a further conversation about how the change we are creating today aligns with your impact goals.
To learn more about our work, visit us at criterioninstitute.org. And if you're enjoying this podcast, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Your reviews help our podcast reach a wider audience. Thanks for listening.